Sandra filed a petition to have me declared legally incapacitated on a Thursday in April, and the first thing I noticed, reading through it, was that she had not attached a single document from a physician. Not a note from my own doctor, who I have seen every 6 months for 19 years. Not a screening from a clinic. Not a single line from anyone who had ever held a stethoscope to my chest. 3 pages, all of it in her own hand, describing a man she said sometimes paused before answering. A man who had reduced his social calendar. A man who had once deferred a financial decision for several weeks because he wanted to think it through. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice. Then I got up and walked to the front room and took down the leather ledger I have kept since 1991. Every property transaction, every trust amendment, every gift over a certain dollar amount, my handwriting in blue ink for 35 years. I did not open it to look anything up. I opened it because holding it steadied me. That was the first time I knew they had stopped seeing me. I am 82 years old. I buried Helen 4 years ago this June. I served 2 years in Korea and 41 years in the lumber business. I have signed my name to enough papers to fill a small library, and I have never once signed anything I had not read. So when my own daughter-in-law sat down at her writing desk and put together a petition saying I could no longer manage my own affairs, she made one assumption that turned out to be the only one that mattered. She assumed I had not already prepared for this. If you have ever seen someone mistake age for weakness, stay with me. And if this story speaks to you, subscribe to my channel for more stories like this, because old hands still know where the records are kept. The papers were served on a Thursday afternoon by a young man in a white shirt who looked like he wished he were anywhere else. He stood on my porch and asked if I was Walter, and when I said I was, he handed me a brown envelope and apologized. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. He was doing his job. I closed the door, walked to the kitchen, set the envelope on the table, and made a cup of coffee before I opened it. The coffee mattered. I want you to understand that. When you have lived as long as I have, you learn that the worst news in the world will still be there in 5 minutes, and you will read it more clearly with a hot cup in front of you than without one. Helen taught me that. She used to say that nothing important should be read standing up. I sat down, I drank half the coffee. Then I opened the envelope. The cover sheet said, "In the matter of Walter. Petition for emergency appointment of guardian." The petitioner was listed as Sandra, my son Robert's wife. The grounds were listed as observed cognitive decline and inability to manage financial affairs. There was a date stamped at the top, and there was a hearing scheduled 21 days out. I read the 3-page letter slowly. I read it the way I used to read contracts when I was still running the mill, with a finger under each line, because that is how I was taught to read anything that had a signature on the bottom. She wrote that I sometimes paused before answering. She wrote that I had reduced my social calendar. She wrote that I had deferred a financial decision for several weeks. She wrote that she was concerned and that her concern was rooted in love. That was the line that did it. Rooted in love. I sat for a long time after that. Not angry, not pacing. I am not a pacing man. I sat with my hands flat on the table and I let the quiet do its work, the way I have always let it. Outside the kitchen window, the dogwood Helen planted in 1986 was just starting to bud. The light was coming in low and yellow the way it does in early spring. There was a robin on the rail of the back porch. After a while, I got up and walked to the front room and brought back the ledger. I want to tell you about that ledger. It was a gift from Helen on our 20th anniversary. Brown leather, slightly worn now at the corners, with my initials embossed on the front in gold that is mostly rubbed off. She gave it to me because she said I was the kind of man who needed a place for everything, and a kitchen drawer full of receipts was not it. I have written in it almost every month since. Property transactions in 1993. The trust we set up in 1998 after Robert's first daughter was born. The amendment in 2004. The gift to the foundation in 2009. The estate planning review in 2018. The voluntary cognitive evaluation with Dr. Chen in 2024. Yes, That one was in there too. I had written down the date and the result, and her name and the address of her office. I had clipped a copy of her summary letter to the inside of the back cover. Helen had been gone 3 years by then. I had gone in for that evaluation because I am the kind of man who plans for things, and I had wanted to know on the record, with standardized scoring, what kind of shape my mind was in. The letter had said I was within normal range for my age across all 12 domains tested. Dr. Chen had signed it. I had brought it home, written down the date, and clipped it to the back of the ledger. I opened to that page now and read the letter again. Then I closed the ledger and held it in my lap. The old file was not forgotten. It was waiting. The next morning, I called Dr. Chen's office at 9. The receptionist remembered me, which I will admit surprised me. She said Dr. Chen had a window at 11 and asked if I could come in. I said I could. I drove down the river road in the truck, parked in the same lot I had parked in 14 months earlier, and walked into the same waiting room with the same green chairs and the same painting of a fishing pier on the wall. Dr. Chen came out herself. She is a small woman in her late 50s with gray at the temples and a way of looking at you that makes you feel like she is actually listening. She walked me back to her office and shut the door. I told her, plainly, what had happened. I gave her the petition. I asked her if she would write a formal competency letter, current dated, that I could file with the court. I told her I did not want a new evaluation if she did not believe one was needed. I wanted her judgment. She read the petition twice. She set it down. Then she looked at me and said, "Walter, I will write the letter today." I asked her how long it would be. She said it would be 12 pages with the original scoring, an updated screen we could do that morning if I had 30 minutes, and her own professional opinion as the supervising clinician. I said 30 minutes was fine. She did the screen at her desk. I want to tell you something about that screen. When you are 82 years old and someone is asking you to repeat back a list of words, or count backwards from 100 by sevens, or copy a figure with a pencil, there is a small voice in the back of your head that says, "What if? What if today is the day? What if she sees something I do not see?" I sat in the chair and I did the work. I counted backwards. I named the animals on the cards. I drew the figure with my right hand, and then because she asked, I drew it with my left. I told her about my breakfast and what I had read in the paper that morning. She wrote things down on a clipboard. When we were done, she set the clipboard aside and said, "Walter, your scores are within normal range for your age across all 12 domains, the same as last time. In some areas slightly better, which she said happens sometimes when a person is paying close attention." She said she would write the letter that afternoon and file it with the court on Friday. I thanked her. I drove home. I made another cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of me, and I thought about how it had taken me one phone call and one drive to the river road to put the answer in motion. They thought I moved slowly because I was weak. I moved slowly because I was careful. I want to back up now and tell you about the months before the petition, because the petition did not come out of nowhere. The petition came out of 3 small moments that I had noticed and remembered, even though Sandra had assumed I would not. The first was at Christmas. We had all gathered at Robert and Sandra's house, the way we have for the last 11 years since Helen got sick the first time. There were 14 of us at the long table, 3 of my grandchildren, 2 of their spouses, the great-grandchildren running underfoot. Sandra had made the ham. Robert had carved it. I had brought the wine, the way I always do, 2 bottles of a Spanish red that Helen and I used to drink on the porch in summer. After dinner, Sandra came over and sat down next to me on the sofa. She had a cup of coffee in her hands, and she was holding it the way people hold a coffee cup when they are about to say something they have rehearsed. She asked me, in a tone she worked to keep light, whether I still handled all of my own banking. I said I did. She asked me whether I found technology harder these days. I said I did not, although I preferred to write checks for some things because I liked the record. She nodded and changed the subject, and I changed it with her, And we talked about the great-grandchildren and about the renovation she was planning on the kitchen and about Robert's golf game. But I remembered the questions. I remembered them the way you remember the sound of a screen door that needs oiling. They stay in the ear long after the door is closed. When I drove home that night, with the leftovers Sandra had packed in a foil pan on the seat beside me, I thought about the way she had set the cup down before she asked, the way her thumb had gone to the rim of it. I had been in business long enough to know what a rehearsed question sounds like. I had heard 1,000 of them across the desk in the mill office, from suppliers, from buyers, from the man who eventually tried to buy the company out from under me in 1994. A rehearsed question has a certain quietness on the front of it. Sandra's questions had that quietness. I knew it when I heard it. I just did not know yet what it was attached to. I got home around 10. I put the leftovers in the icebox. I went into the front room and I took down the ledger. I did not write anything in it that night. I just opened it and looked at the last few pages, the way you look at a fence line you have walked 100 times, just to be sure of where it sits. Then I closed it and put it back. The second moment was in February. My accountant, Frank, called me on a Wednesday afternoon. Frank has done my taxes since 1992. He is 67 years old, 3 years from his own retirement, and I trust him the way I trust my own brother. He called me, and he said, "Walter, I want you to know your son called me this morning." I asked him what about. He said Robert had called and asked in a roundabout way whether I had made any unusual financial moves lately, whether there was anything Frank had noticed, whether the books looked the way Frank would expect them to look. Frank had told him, politely, that he could not discuss a client's account with anyone but the client, and that Robert was welcome to bring it up with me directly. The call had ended shortly after. I thanked Frank. I asked him to write down the date and the content of the call on a sheet of paper and to put it in my file. He said he would. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the yard and thought about Robert, my only son, 54 years old this year, calling my accountant behind my back. I did not call Robert that night. I did not call him the next morning. I sat with it the way I have learned to sit with most things, and I waited to see what would come next. I will tell you something about Robert. He was a good boy. He was the kind of boy who would come out to the workshop on a Saturday and stand next to me at the bench and hand me whichever tool I asked for, even when he was 9 years old, and the tool was almost as long as his arm. He played first base on his little league team. He cried at his mother's funeral the way I have only seen one other man cry. He is not a bad man. He is a man who married a woman who is louder than he is, and who has spent 30 years learning to keep the peace at his own dinner table by making small concessions, and who one day made a concession that was not small. I knew that on the day Frank called me. I did not need a petition to tell me. The petition only told me how far it had gone. The third moment was in March. A woman named Doris, who had been on the hospital foundation board with both Sandra and Helen, mailed me a letter. Helen and Doris had been close. Doris had been at the funeral. She wrote that she felt awkward sending what she was sending, but she felt I should know. She enclosed a photocopy of a letter Sandra had written to a third party, a woman who was apparently being considered for some volunteer role and had asked for character references. The letter was mostly about the volunteer role, but there was a paragraph in the middle, almost a sentence in passing, where Sandra had written that her father-in-law was not really himself since Helen, and that the family was beginning to think about next steps for him. I read it once. I folded the letter and the photocopy together and put them in a manila folder. I wrote the date on the tab in felt-tip pen. I put the folder in the second drawer of the desk in the front room, the drawer where I keep the papers that may matter later. That phrase, "not really himself since Helen." I have rolled that phrase around in my head more than I would like to admit. There is a version of it that is true. I am not the man I was when Helen was alive. No man is the same after 53 years, and then a hospital room, and then a small graveside, and then 4 years of waking up to a house that does not have her in it. Of course, I am not the same. But the part of me that handles the bank and the trust and the deed and the ledger, that part is exactly who it was. That part Helen and I built together, and when she went, she left it with me whole. Sandra confused grief for decline. They are not the same thing. A man can be quieter at the dinner table and still know, down to the dollar, what is in the trust account on the morning of the third Tuesday of every month. So when the petition arrived in April, it did not arrive in a vacuum. It arrived after the Christmas questions, and after the call to Frank, and after the letter Doris sent. It arrived as the fourth thing, and by then I had 3 other things filed away, dated, in folders, in a drawer. Some lessons take a lifetime to learn and 1 document to teach. I want to tell you about the morning I drove to the courthouse to file Dr. Chen's letter. It was a Friday. The light was the same low yellow as the morning the papers had been served. I put on the dark gray suit I wore to Helen's funeral, because it was the suit I wore to anything that mattered, and I knotted the tie the way she had taught me to knot it 40 years ago, with the wide end coming down a little past the belt. Before I left the house, I stood at the mantel for a moment. There is a photograph of Helen there in a silver frame, taken on the back porch in the summer of 2018, the last summer she was well. She is wearing a blue dress, and she is laughing at something I said that I cannot now remember. I told her the situation was well in hand. I do not think of that as unusual. I think of it as keeping her informed. We were married for 53 years. She was the one who reminded me to be careful and to be slow and to write things down. I did not feel foolish telling her photograph that the matter would be resolved by Tuesday. I felt, if anything, that I owed her the report. I drove to the courthouse. I parked in the visitor lot. I walked up the granite steps the same way I had walked them the day Robert was born, and I had gone to register him at Vital Records 54 years and a lifetime ago. I went to the probate division on the 3rd floor. I handed Dr. Chen's letter, all 12 pages, sealed in a manila envelope, to the clerk at the counter. She read the cover page. She looked up at me. She said, "Sir, are you Walter?" I said I was. She said, "You can leave this with me. I will see that it is filed today." I thanked her. I walked out of the building. I drove home. I changed out of the suit and hung it back in the closet next to Helen's good coat that I have not given away. I made a sandwich. I ate it at the kitchen table. The ledger was on the table. I did not open it. That afternoon, I called my estate attorney. His name is Howard. He is 71 years old, and he has been my lawyer since 1989. I told him what had happened. I told him what I had filed. I asked him to come out the next morning so we could talk. Howard arrived at 9 on Saturday with a leather case under his arm and the same wire-rimmed glasses he has worn since the Reagan administration. We sat at the kitchen table. I had the ledger between us. I had a fresh pot of coffee and the old porcelain cups Helen had liked, the ones with the small chip on the saucers. He never asked to open the ledger. Both of us knew it was there. We have known each other a long time, Howard and I. He drafted the trust the year Robert's first daughter was born. He drafted the amendment in 2004 when we sold the second piece of land. He sat with Helen and me at this same table in 2018 and walked us through the estate review. He came to her funeral. He stood at the back of the church and he did not say a word, because Howard is a man who knows when to be quiet, and he stayed for the reception and ate 1 piece of pound cake on a paper plate, and then he left. He is the kind of lawyer you want when you are old. He does not raise his voice. He does not bill you for the phone call. He looks at a problem the way a carpenter looks at a warped board, with patience, with an eye for the grain, with no interest in pretending the problem is something other than what it is. I told him everything. The Christmas questions, the call to Frank, the letter Doris had forwarded, the petition, the drive to Dr. Chen, the filing on Friday. He listened. He took notes on a yellow pad. When I was done, he set down his pen and looked at me over his glasses and said, "Walter, the petition will be dismissed, probably by Tuesday." There is no medical evidence attached. The standard for emergency guardianship in this state is high, and Dr. Chen's letter is going to be unanswerable. The court will not entertain it. I asked him what would happen to Robert and Sandra after. He said the petition would be a matter of public record. The court file would show it. Anyone who pulled the docket would see it. He said that in his experience, that fact alone was usually enough. I asked him about the trust. He said the trust was sound. It had been drafted in 1998, amended 3 times, last reviewed by him in February of last year. The trustee structure was layered. The successor trustees had been chosen carefully. The provisions for incapacity had specific medical triggers that had not been met and were not going to be. He said, "Walter, there is no door here that you have not already locked. I want to be clear about something. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt the kind of tired you feel when you have been carrying something for a long time and you finally set it down." Howard finished his coffee. He gathered his papers. He stood up to leave. At the door, he turned and said, "I am sorry, Walter." I said, "So am I." He left. I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car pull out of the drive. Then I sat back down at the table with the ledger and I wrote the date and the entry. April 25th. Petition for emergency guardianship filed by Sandra. Response letter from Dr. Patricia Chen, 12 pages, filed Friday, April 26th. Estate attorney Howard consulted Saturday morning. No further action required at this time. I closed the ledger. I put it back on the shelf in the front room. The old file was not forgotten. It was waiting. And what it had been waiting for was exactly this. Monday morning, I got a call from Howard at 10. He said Robert's attorney had withdrawn from the case. I asked him if that meant what I thought it meant. He said it did. He said it usually meant the attorney had reviewed Dr. Chen's letter, had looked at the original petition, and had concluded that there was no path forward. I asked Howard if Robert and Sandra had been notified. He said it depended. The court would notify them in writing of the dismissal once it was entered. The attorney's withdrawal was a separate notification. He said it was possible they did not yet know. Tuesday morning, the petition was dismissed. Howard called me at 11 to confirm. He said the order had come down from the judge that morning. He said the file was closed. He congratulated me, although he did not use that word, because Howard is a careful man, and he knew this was not a thing to be congratulated about. That afternoon, I sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee and watched the dogwood. The buds had opened over the weekend. The first white blossoms were out. Helen had planted that tree the year Robert turned 14. It was now 39 years old, almost as old as my marriage had been when she went. Wednesday, I went into town to pick up a part for the lawn tractor. I ran into a man I have known for 30 years at the hardware store. He asked me how the family was. I said the family was the family. He laughed because he understood what that meant. We talked about the weather. I drove home. Thursday morning, Robert called the house at 8:45. I let it ring. I was not avoiding him. I was making breakfast, and I had eggs in the pan, and I was not going to leave them. I let the machine pick up. His voice on the machine was the voice of a man who did not yet know what to say. He said, "Dad." Then he said, "Dad, can you call me?" Then he said, "Please." Then he hung up. I finished the eggs. I sat down. I ate them. I drank a cup of coffee. Then I picked up the phone and called him back. I want to tell you what happened next, because this is the part that mattered. Although I did not raise my voice and there were no fireworks and nobody was crushed beneath a stack of papers. He said, "Dad, we just got back from the courthouse." I said, "Did you?" He said, "There was no hearing. The clerk told us the petition had been dismissed on Tuesday." I said, "I know." There was a long pause on his end of the line, long enough that I could hear the sound of a dog barking on his street through the receiver and the sound of Sandra's voice in the background, although I could not make out the words. He said, "You knew on Tuesday." I said, "I knew on Monday." There was another pause. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "You filed a petition saying I was not competent to manage my own affairs. You did not consult a doctor. You did not call me. You did not ask me a single question. You tried to take from me the one thing your mother and I built together, which is the right of an old man to live his own life. I do not owe you a phone call about how that turned out." He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Sandra is upset." I said, "I imagine she is." He said, "We were trying to help." I said, "Robert, you have known me your entire life. You have known me for 54 years. You know what help looks like when it comes from me. It looks like a phone call. It looks like sitting at the kitchen table. It looks like a question. It does not look like a court filing without a doctor's name on it." He said, "Dad?" I said, "I am not angry. I want you to know that. I am not angry, and I am not going to argue with you, and I am not going to tell you what to think about your wife. That is between the two of you. But I am going to tell you something, and you are going to listen, because I have earned the right to say one thing today without being interrupted." He said, "Yes, sir." He had not called me sir since he was 19. I said, "You are my son. I love you. I have loved you since the morning your mother handed you to me wrapped in a blanket from the hospital. I am going to love you on the day they put me in the ground next to her. None of that is going to change." I said, "But you have to understand something. I have been keeping records since before you could read. I have been writing things down in a book on a shelf in the front room since 1991. There is not a transaction in this family, not a gift, not a trust, not a property line, not a deed, that is not on a page in that book in my own handwriting, with a date and a witness when one was required. Your mother and I built this with our hands, and I am not going to be erased by a 3-page letter that is rooted in love." He started to say something. I let him stop. I said, "You can come out to the house this weekend if you want. Just you. Not Sandra, not yet. We will sit on the porch. You will bring nothing. I will bring nothing. We will talk about the dogwood your mother planted, and we will see where we are." He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Goodbye, son." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that. The phone made the small clicking sound it makes when it is settling back into the cradle. The clock in the front room struck 9. The robin was on the porch rail again, the same one or one of his cousins. I did not cry. I am not a man who cries easily, although I have done my share of it since Helen went. I felt the tiredness again, the deep tiredness of carrying something for a long time and finally setting it down. I thought about something my own father had told me the year before he died. He was 86. He was sitting on the porch of the farmhouse outside of Cedar Falls, in the chair he had built with his own hands in 1951, and he said to me, "Walter, the hardest thing about getting old is not the body. The body is going to do what the body is going to do. The hardest thing is watching the people you raised forget that you are still in the room." I was 48 years old when he said that. I did not understand it. I understood it the way you understand the words of a song in a foreign language. I could repeat it back, but the meaning was on the other side of a wall. I am on the other side of that wall now. I understood it the morning the papers were served. I understood it more fully on the morning Robert called from his car after the courthouse. My father had been right. He had been right about almost everything, and I had spent the years between 48 and 82 slowly catching up to him. I got up. I went to the front room. I took down the ledger. I sat down with it at the kitchen table, and I wrote one more entry. April 30th. Phone call from Robert. Petition dismissal acknowledged. Conversation conducted civilly. Invitation extended for Saturday. No further action required at this time. I closed the book. Robert came on Saturday. He drove out alone. He was wearing the kind of clothes a man wears when he does not know what he is walking into, a button-down shirt and a pair of khakis that looked freshly ironed. He parked in the drive. He came up the front steps the same way he had come up them 10,000 times in his life, and he stopped at the screen door and waited for me to open it, the way he had waited as a boy. I opened it. I held it for him. He came in. We did not embrace. We are not a family that embraces easily. We never have been. I made coffee. I poured 2 cups. I carried them out to the back porch, and we sat in the 2 chairs that have been on that porch since the porch was built, the chairs that Helen and I used to sit in on summer evenings to watch the light go. We were quiet for a while. Then Robert said, "Dad?" I said, "Robert." He said, "I am sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "Sandra was scared. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought she was helping." I said, "I do not want to talk about Sandra today. I want to talk about you." He said, "All right." I said, "You called Frank. You called my accountant. You did not call me." He looked at his hands. He did not answer. I said, "Why?" He said, "I did not know how to ask you. I did not know how to ask you if you were all right. I thought if I asked Frank, and Frank said you were fine, then I could put it down." I said, "Did it occur to you that the question itself was the thing?" He said, "Yes. After. It did." I said, "You are my son. I have raised you to ask hard questions of the people who deserve to be asked them. If you want to know how I am, you ask me. You sit at this table, the way you are sitting now, and you ask. You do not call my accountant. You do not sign a petition. You do not let your wife write a 3-page letter about my pauses." He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "You do not need to call me sir." He said, "I do today." We were quiet again. The dogwood was in full bloom by then. The wind moved through it, and a few of the white petals came loose and drifted across the yard. A boy in the neighbor's yard was riding a bicycle in slow circles on the gravel of the drive. You could hear the small ticking sound of the freewheel coming through the still afternoon, and once in a while the bell on the handlebars when he hit a bump. It was the kind of afternoon that reminded me of every other spring afternoon I had ever sat through. The same light, the same wind, the same petals coming off the same tree. I said, "Robert, I am 82 years old. I am not going to live forever. There is going to come a day, and it may be sooner than you think, when I am not the man I am right now. I do not know which year it will be. I do not know which faculty will go first. I have made arrangements. I have named successor trustees. I have signed the papers. Howard has them. Frank has them. Dr. Chen has them. When that day comes, you will be informed. You will be involved. You will not need to file anything." I said, "But that day is not today." He said, "No, sir." I said, "And until that day, I am the man I am, and I am going to live in this house, and I am going to write in my book on the shelf in the front room, and I am going to keep my own counsel about my own affairs, and I am going to love you, and you are going to come out here, alone, twice a month, until we have built back the thing your wife tried to take down, and we will see, after some time, about Sandra." He said, "Yes, sir." We finished the coffee. He stayed for lunch. I made grilled cheese the way Helen used to make it, with the butter on the outside and a slice of tomato in the middle. He ate 2 of them. I had not seen him eat 2 of anything in 15 years. Before he left, he stood in the front room. He looked at the ledger on the shelf. He did not ask to open it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has just begun to understand. I said, "You can read it someday." He said, "When?" I said, "When you are ready." He nodded. He drove away. I stood in the doorway and watched the truck go down the drive, the same drive he had ridden his bicycle on as a boy, the same drive he had driven down for the first time as a 16-year-old with a learner's permit, and his mother in the passenger seat clutching the door handle. I went back inside. I made another cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table. I want to tell you what I have learned from all of this. I am not going to give you a speech, because a speech is not what this is. But I am going to tell you what I have come to understand. Sitting here in this kitchen, 82 years old, 4 years a widower, with 1 petition dismissed, and 1 son slowly finding his way back. The first thing I have learned is that a careful man is not the same as a slow man. Sandra read my pauses as decline. They were not decline. They were the sound of a man who was thinking. I have been thinking with my hands flat on a table and a cup of coffee in front of me for 60 years, and I am not going to apologize for it now. The second thing I have learned is that records matter. Not because they are proof against your enemies. Records matter because they are proof to yourself. When you are old and someone tells you that you do not remember what you remember, the only way to know for certain is to have written it down. I wrote it down. I have been writing it down since 1991. The book on the shelf in the front room is not a weapon. It is a memory I trust more than my own. The third thing I have learned is that worry can be a costume. Sandra told the court her concern was rooted in love. It may have been. I am not the judge of her heart. But love does not file emergency petitions without a doctor's name on them. Love calls. Love comes out to the porch. Love asks the question of the man it claims to love. The fourth thing I have learned is that quiet is not weakness. I did not raise my voice once during this. I did not slam a door. I did not write a letter back. I made one phone call to Dr. Chen. I made one drive to the courthouse. I made one Saturday morning meeting with Howard. The quietest path is sometimes also the shortest. And the fifth thing I have learned, and this is the one I want to leave you with, is that an old man with a ledger on his shelf is not a helpless old man. He is a record keeper. He is a witness to his own life. He is a man who has been preparing for a moment like this one for 35 years, even though he never knew which year it would come. The petition was dismissed on a Tuesday. I knew on Monday. The family arrived at the courthouse on Thursday. I was not there. I had nowhere to be. I was at home with my coffee and my dogwood and my book, where I have been all along. And if stories like this remind you that quiet elders are not helpless, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes the oldest person in the room remembers the most important truth. I am going to close the book now. The ledger is on the shelf where it has always been. The afternoon light is coming in across the porch the way it did the day Helen planted the dogwood, the day Robert was born, the day the papers were served. The light does not change. The light is the one thing I have always been able to count on. Helen, the situation is well in hand. Robert is coming back next Saturday. I will sit here until he does.